This demonstration will cover the wide belt sander. Now the wide belt sander is set up very similar to a planer in that it has a belt that goes around and actually makes it a little bit thinner, except instead of using blades for a planer, we use a wide belt. Now the belt is 37 inches wide, so it gives us a 36-inch wide amount of sanding space. It just leaves a little bit extra on both sides so that you can sand a nice wide piece of wood. Now the main difference between the sander and the planer is that the sander only sands off about 5/1000ths of an inch, which is roughly the thickness of a piece of paper. The planer will do about a 1/16 of an inch, roughly 10 times that. With blades going, it can just take off more. So this one, you can't expect it to sand off nearly as much as the planer. It goes much slower. The planer, we plane it down to the proper thickness, 13/16. And that last 1/16 of an inch, we take off with the sander, sanding both sides, so it's nice and smooth. Of all the machines in the shop, this one will save you the most time because then you don't have to hand sand everything down. It just takes forever. Now, when you when you come up to the machine, you need to turn it on. Now, the thing to remember is none of these switches will work until you turn on the air. The air pressure has to be running first, and that's found on the opposite side of the machine. Right here, if you look at this tube and follow it to the base, there's a little yellow handle. You need to turn it vertical. Anywhere horizontal is off, vertical is on. Just turn the handle up or down, and you'll kind of hear it start hissing. That means air pressure has come into this, and the belt is pulled apart tightly. Once it's tight, then it's ready to work. So here's how you run it through. I have a piece of alder here that we're going to sand and set up so you can see it. This is called the compression switch, the compression knob, if you will. There's a knob at the top with a switch and another little piece of metal down below, and you need to put your board between them, and it measures how thick it is for you. So you don't even need a tape measure in this case. So what you do, you can see all these buttons on here. There's an up arrow and a down arrow. It's pretty self-explanatory. We need to lower the table, and this table is now dropping down. You can see the numbers are changing to a little over 1 inch. All of my wood is 15/16 thick when it comes from the factory. So I go a little over 1 inch, so I know that's wide enough, and I just put my board right there and just set it there. You don't have to have it off. I don't want it here. I actually want it sitting on the table itself. Now press and hold the up arrow, and the machine will stop itself when it gets to the right measurement. So press and hold right there, and it says it is 0.92 inches thick, which is about 15/16. Then you're ready to go. There's no adjustments, there's no anything else. You set it till it stops itself, and you're ready to start. So let's go ahead and run it through. Now what I do whenever I run boards through the sander, I like to take a pencil and put a little pencil line on there. So when that's gone, I know it is sanded correctly down to what I want, or at least it gets all the rough stuff off. Then turn on the belt and turn on the conveyor belt, and you just drop it in and let it run. I keep my eye on this, and I'll get back to that in a second. You pull it out the other side, and you can see that my pencil line is all gone. Now, we need to do the other side, but like the planer, I have to raise the table a little bit. So what you want to do is tap the up arrow. Here's the up, tap it, and it automatically raises to the right amount, 5/1000ths of an inch. Then we flip the board over and do the other side. And now when I pull it out, it's done another 5/1000ths on this side. Now it's up to you how much you want to sand, but I've now done both sides. They're fairly smooth. It may need a little bit more, but it depends on how far you need to take it down. To turn it off, it's these two red buttons here, this one and this one. It doesn't matter what order you press them in, and as well as the on-off, it doesn't make a bit of difference. This right here is an emergency stop. If there's a problem with the machine, or it's sanding too much, or it's making funny sounds, or any problem, then we hit this button. This activates a brake. It actually clamps onto the disc that's running it, and like the brake in your car, it clamps on and stops the machine really fast. Now the problem is, the more you use this, the more it wears out. And so like the brake of your car, you'll have to change it out. So to turn it off, hit these two red buttons next to the on-off buttons, and it slows down, and it's much easier on the machine. On the brake, for sure. Don't use this unless it is actually an emergency. This is not the off switch. That's emergency stop. Now that brings me to a few points. What are some accidents that I've seen on the machine? First of all, when you're done with the machine, with all the machines running in the shop, a common accident that I've seen is kids will turn off the machine and then immediately go and shut the air off. Now if you do that, the machine is still slowing down. Once you turn off the air, the belt collapses. The air pressure is gone, the belt now starts flopping around. The more it flops around, the chances are it'll tear. And as soon as it tears, the next guy that turns it on, you'll see pieces of belt flying all over the place, coming out the front and probably popping out the sides. So make sure, this mistake is you turn it off, and I put my hand on the side because with all the other machines running, I can't really hear if this is running. Once the vibrations are gone, then I can go turn it off. Now that being said, most of the time during class, the first guy that turns it on will just leave the air on. I mean, it's not a big deal. I can hear it hissing when it's just me, so I will turn it off now. And it takes a moment or two for the air pressure to kind of ease down and then it goes away. But if you're the first guy using it, just go ahead and leave it on, the air on. I mean, yeah, turn off the machine, but leave the air running. The other accident, and probably the worst I've seen, and this is as bad as it's going to get, similar to the planer. You put your board in like this and you have your fingers underneath it. And then of course the belt or the roller that grabs it will push down. Of course, it wants to be flat. If your fingers are under there, this table isn't metal, slippery metal anymore. It is a rubberized, grippy, tabletop that grabs your wood and it grabs your fingers. It'll grab the skin on your fingers. So if you're under here and that thing clamps down, it's really hard to pull your hands back out. That is the reason there are 2 emergency stops. First, we already know about this one, but the second one is right here in front. So you can see the red bar all the way across, push, emergency. If anything happens and your hands get stuck, hit the emergency brake with your leg. I mean, it's right in front of you. So all you've got to do is something goes wrong, you can hit it, it stops, and then you can pull your hands out, have somebody lower the table, whatever it takes, whatever the problem happens to be. But try not to hit this. Obviously, don't hit it in the middle of your cut. Everything will shut down. But this is an emergency brake along the front. So if you hit it, everything will shut down. We can fix the problem. But that's about as bad as it gets. I've never seen anybody injure themselves by putting their hand in there or anything like that. The door on the side is unlocked, but that's so I can change belts out. I have a couple different grits. Most of the time, for beginners especially, it'll be the same belt the whole time. But if I need to change it out, the door's open and I can check and make sure everything is lined up right. Once in a while, the belt will track itself too far to one side. And usually that happens when you shut it down. It just tends to track a little bit usually to this side, to the left side. And if that happens, then I can't turn it back on. There's a safety switch inside. I know you can't see on the camera, but if it goes too far to one side, it activates the switch and it won't turn on. It doesn't want to break the belt. That's the whole point. So if you come up and it's not turning on, but the air is on and you know it should be working, let me know. I usually just have to shift the belt one way or another and you're back in business. All right, so some other things on the machine. I can raise and lower the table manually with this little wheel at the bottom, though we don't use it often. You just have to keep cranking it. Eventually it'll go up or down. Up and down, set, start, stop. For the most part, we don't mess with all the numbers unless I give you a very specific measurement. It's usually just up arrow and down arrow. Now I mentioned this gauge. As it's running, the machine usually runs around 25 amps, maybe a hair more, but right around 25. When I run a board through, my eyes are always on this amp meter. If it gets up past about 30 amps, you're sanding way too much. The most common way to know if you're sanding too much is the sound. If you hear a loud screeching sound, and it's pretty obvious when it happens, then hit the emergency stop and let's figure out what's going on. You probably set it too deep. Now, some other things that are going on with this, let me get a different board. We also sand larger things, say a face frame, or we of course send through the lid of your nightstands, and these are rather large. For the big stuff, you want to run it through the sander at an angle, first of all. Now if I put this thing in like this, it's a wide piece of wood, and the belt will hit this entire edge at the same time, and you'll see this amp meter kind of go up quite a bit and then lower back down as you go on, because it'll hit the centers here. All I do is I turn it at an angle. Now when it goes through, it hits the corner and gets a little bit wider as it goes. It eases into the board. It's easier on the motor. And that is especially true when you are doing your lids. It'll hit that entire edge at the same time, and you'll see this thing go way up, and then it kind of eases down a little bit as it goes. Go ahead and put it at an angle. And then it eases into the board. It gets to the max, to the corners here, and then it eases back out again. It's just easier on the machine, on the motor. Now, the downside of that is when you sand across the grain, you get these weird marks that go the direction of the grain, of course. Now, I put it through at an angle, so the marks will go this way at an angle. We want the marks to go with the grain. Any scratches at all, go with the grain. They're easier to sand out. So I sand the bulk of my project at an angle, but the very last run on both sides, I'll run it through straight. So yes, there are times, of course, I will just run it through straight, and that's fine. I just am trying to keep the motor in good a shape as possible for as long as possible. If I don't have to replace it ever, that would be even better. But you always want to end sanding with the grain. That gives you by far the best results. If I sand it across the grain like that, it will sand it. I want you to know that it will sand, and it'll get through just fine. It's not going to tear it up like the planer. It won't. It will just leave bad sanding marks across the grain. So make sure your last runs go with the grain. It'll just save you a lot of time on the sander. So listen for those sounds. Now, when you set up something like this, you want to put it in the compression knob like we did with the other board. In my last school, this happened. He was doing a really big desktop, so we're talking 3 times the size of this. What he did is he put it in the knob and then accidentally let go of the end, and the end dropped, so it acted like a lever and went up and made the distance between the compression knob and that little pin at the bottom greater. By doing that, the machine now has to close further. It thinks the board is thinner. It's a hard way to explain it. The machine now has to close further to think it's in the right place, and you're sanding way too much. That's why when you are setting up a big board, make sure that the majority of it is on the table and you've got a good grip. You don't want to let go and drop it down and lever this thing up and open more. Then it just will sand way too much and you'll damage the machine. So sand things at a slight angle and then sand them straight through. So this stays around 25 amps. It cuts off about 5/1000ths of an inch, like I said before. When you're doing multiple pieces, especially little ones, you can go ahead and run 5 or 6 or 7 of them through at once, very similar to the planer. It'll handle them without too much of a problem. But again, keep your eye on the amp meter and make sure that does not pass about 30 amps. 30 amps is a problem. So when you shut this whole thing down, make sure to hit the off buttons, turn off the air, and walk away, and it'll do a great job sanding and save you hours of time.